Welcome to the Explainer. All right, let's jump straight into it. Today, we're unpacking one of the most famous and honestly most intensely debated texts in the entire history of political science. I'm talking about Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. More specifically, we're zooming in on chapter 18. This chapter lays out a foundational concept that has literally echoed through the corridors of power for over 500 years. We're going to dig into the deep and often pretty surprising intellectual architecture beneath its most famous yet totally misunderstood idea. So get ready, because we are stripping away the myths to look at the raw mechanics of power.
Now, you have definitely heard this one before. A ruler must be a fox and a lion at the same time. It's one of those quotes that gets plastered absolutely everywhere, from corporate business seminars to high school history textbooks. And while a lot of people memorize this famous line, today's explainer is going to peel back the layers to reveal its direct, highly subversive clash with classical philosophy. We're going to look at where this concept actually comes from and why it was such a massive shock to the political thinkers of the Renaissance.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the misunderstood nature of the prince, touch on the myth of the centaur, break down the lion, fox, force, and fraud, and then look at Machiavelli's rebellion against Cicero. After that, we'll examine the reality of broken promises and connect all of this to universal legacies like Kautilya and Hobbes. Part 1. The Misunderstood Prince, Navigating the Corridors of Power. Okay, so to really grasp chapter 18, we have to look at the very first distinction Machiavelli makes about conflict and leadership. He kicks things off with a highly pragmatic observation. He essentially says, look, there are basically two ways of fighting. The first is with law. This is the method of humans, right? It relies on rules, institutions, and civilized structures. The second way is with force, and this is the method of beasts, relying on raw power, instinct, and outright domination. Now, in a perfect world, a ruler would only ever need to use the law. But Machiavelli points out a really uncomfortable truth here. Relying on law alone just doesn't cut it in the real world. Because human laws frequently fail to restrain ambitious or wicked people, a successful ruler absolutely must master both the human and the beastly methods. Moving on to part 2, the myth of the centaur and its classical origins. To make this somewhat abstract idea of a dual nature really stick, Machiavelli reaches way back into vivid classical mythology. Think about ancient Greek tradition. The great heroes and princes, guys like the legendary Achilles, they didn't just go to some regular human tutor. No, they were sent to be trained by Chiron, who is a centaur. And a centaur, being half human and half horse, perfectly symbolizes this dual necessity. By pulling in this myth, Machiavelli elegantly proves a point. A ruler simply cannot survive by leaning exclusively on their human rationality, nor can they survive purely on animalistic power. They have to be trained in both natures. One without the other is just a recipe for total collapse. Part 3. Lion, Fox, Force, and Fraud. Let's look at the mechanics of the beast. Having established that a ruler must sometimes act like a beast, Machiavelli takes it a step further. He doesn't just say be a beast, he divides that nature into two distinct, highly strategic animals that perfectly map out political strategy. He says a ruler must choose to be both the lion and the fox. Why these two? Well, the lion represents raw strength and fear. Politically speaking, this is force, your military and physical control. But here's the catch. The lion has a fatal flaw. It can't recognize traps. It can roar and scare off a pack of wolves, sure, but it easily gets snared. The fox, on the other hand, represents cunning and foresight. Politically, this is fraud, which covers diplomacy, strategy, and deception. The fox can spot a trap a mile away, but it's physically way too weak to fight off those wolves. So you see the problem? A leader relying only on the lion doesn't understand politics, and a leader relying only on the fox will eventually get overpowered. Both force and fraud are absolutely vital tools in the ruler's toolkit. Part 4. The Rebellion against Cicero, the Great Classical Clash. This right here is the intellectual climax of our whole analysis. To deeply understand Machiavelli, you have to understand exactly who he was arguing against. He was completely subverting a 1,400-year-old Roman philosophy. 14 centuries earlier, the great Roman philosopher Cicero wrote this highly influential book on duties called De Officiis. In it, Cicero actually used this exact same analogy. He said that injustice comes in two forms: through force, which belongs to the lion, and through fraud, which belongs to the fox. But Cicero's conclusion was that both of these are purely animalistic, completely unworthy of mankind, and deeply, deeply shameful. Fraud, Cicero argued, was especially despicable. So here is the crucial takeaway. Machiavelli deliberately stole Cicero's exact framework, but he flipped the moral conclusion entirely. Where Cicero saw deep shame, Machiavelli saw strategic necessity. He argues that using force and fraud isn't something to be ashamed of. It is a vital, inescapable requirement for a state's survival. Scholars actually call this Machiavelli's moral revolution because he deliberately shattered the classical moral consensus.
Which brings us to part 5, broken promises and the power of adaptability.
So how does this theoretical dual nature apply to the incredibly messy real world of leadership, especially when handling alliances? Well, Machiavelli gives a shockingly blunt piece of advice here. He states that a wise ruler should not keep a promise if honoring it would cause them harm or if the original reasons for making the promise no longer exist. He justifies this with a pretty grim view of human nature. Look, if all people were completely good, this would be terrible advice. But because humans are inherently flawed and self-interested, they will readily break their promises to you. Therefore, you are under absolutely no obligation to keep yours to them. The source material points to the historical example of Pope Alexander VI. This was a man who, according to Machiavelli, did almost nothing but deceive people. Yet Alexander VI always succeeded. Why? Because the world is full of gullible cargots willing to believe a well-crafted illusion. And that perfectly highlights the core of Machiavellian strategy. It's all about image management. That is the fox's ultimate deception. A ruler must appear merciful, faithful, and religious to the public without ever being strictly bound by those virtues behind closed doors. Furthermore, this connects right back to Machiavelli's broader theme of fortuna, or fortune. The times are constantly changing, right? Therefore, the ultimate key to political success is situational adaptability. Take Pope Julius II, for example. He succeeded by brilliantly adapting his highly aggressive nature to the exact demands of his era. A ruler must know precisely when to deploy the roaring lion and when to quietly slip in as the cunning fox. Hearing all of this naturally leads us to a massive hanging question. Is this theory just flat out immoral? I mean, we use the word Machiavellian today as a synonym for evil, ruthless, and purely manipulative behavior. But is that entirely fair to what the text actually says? The 20th century philosopher Isaiah Berlin offered a brilliant insight into this that really reshapes how we view the prince. Berlin argued that Machiavelli wasn't simply praising evil or promoting sadism. Not at all. Instead, Machiavelli was exposing a terrifying truth. There are two fundamentally incompatible moralities in the world. On one hand, you have Christian or private morality. This values humility, forgiveness, and absolute honesty. On the other hand, you have civic or political morality, and this demands harsh, calculated decisions, force, and deception to protect the state and ensure the collective survival of the people. Berlin points out that you simply cannot always practice both. Sometimes, to fulfill the duties of a political leader and protect the state, one must actively sacrifice private moral virtues. So it's not actually about being evil, it's about the tragic reality of having to choose between two competing moral codes.
Part 6, Cotilla and Legacy, the universal language of statecraft.
What's fascinating is that Machiavelli wasn't just some historical outlier. His controversial framework maps directly onto other monumental works of political science across time and geography. If we look at ancient India, Kautilya's Arthashastra outlines 4 policies of statecraft. Among them, danda, which means punishment and force, aligns perfectly with Machiavelli's lion. Meanwhile, dhamma and beta, persuasion and sowing discord, align directly with the cunning of the fox. Jump forward to the 17th century in England, and Thomas Hobbes writes in his masterpiece, Leviathan, that in the brutal state of nature, which is basically a state of war, force and fraud are the 2 cardinal virtues. Even today, in modern diplomacy, we see this exact dynamic playing out constantly. The balance between hard power, military and economic might, and soft power, diplomatic cunning and cultural influence, is essentially just the modern translation of the lion and the fox. This beautifully proves that Machiavelli's concepts aren't just quirky Renaissance ideas. They are the foundational, inescapable realities of international relations. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought for you to chew on. When we call a leader Machiavellian,
Are we truly insulting them? Or are we simply acknowledging the unavoidable, highly practical reality of what it takes to survive and govern in a complex, often hostile modern political world? Where Cicero saw shame, Machiavelli saw the necessary tools for survival. It's a fascinating paradigm shift that really challenges our deepest moral assumptions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If this sparked your curiosity, you definitely won't want to miss our next deep dive, where we'll unpack another of Machiavelli's explosive concepts, the intricate balance between cruelty and mercy.